Well, we are in the middle of a series through the book of Colossians. If it's your first week to be here, today's sermon doesn't technically, you don't have to know the other stuff to come in and pick something up. I'm hoping that today, even though I think it's kind of a controversial passage for a reason or two, I'm hoping today that you can pick up the bigger things that God's trying to teach. I think there's a lot of wisdom in just a very short few verses about how family and how relationships and how all of our relationships, family and work, all of it, how they're supposed to work. And I think there's a guideline in there that if you could really pick it up, I think will transform most relationships and most families. And I wanted to kind of talk about that and think about that today. Tolstoy, in his book Anna Karenina, has this quote. It's the first line in the book. He says, "All happy families are more or less like one another. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own particular way." Now, I think this bears the test of truth. If you kind of walk around and look around, when you see a happy family, normally happy families all pretty much have the same handful of things working for them. They're all sort of about the same things. They all have some empathy or compassion for each other. There may be some sarcasm sprinkled in there too, but they all genuinely seem to like the best of each other. There's a sense of order in the house. Now, it doesn't mean it's everything is perfect. I don't mean that, but it's not chaos all the time. There seems like there's some order to it, and they're pretty open with one another. They can talk and communicate, and there's no deep, dark secrets that you can't trust with one another. All happy families are more or less like one another. But every unhappy family, Tolstoy's thought here is that there's a right way to go, but there's a million wrong ways then, right? Every other way is wrong, and every unhappy family, they're unhappy in their own way. One family may be scarred by this thing, or another family scarred by that one, and it's tricky. It's tricky. You know, in a church like ours, if there were, say, 5 unhappy families out there today, or 10 or 15, Tolstoy's quote would be that each of them would be unhappy for a different reason. Maybe one's unhappy because the communication's real bad, or another's unhappy because their financial stuff is just a mess, or one's unhappy because there's some secrets in there that are causing trouble, or addiction, or it can be 1,000 things, 1,000,000 things, right? Every unhappy family, there's unique reasons why they're unhappy. And so you don't want to focus too much on the negative, because there's a million negatives, you know. You kind of want to focus on the positive. You want to focus on the dream. When it's working right, what would it look like? And then, hopefully, families that aren't quite where the dream is, they could make little adjustments to get to that spot. You try to focus on what it would look like if it was moving smoothly. And once you have your focus on that, then maybe people who are not quite where they ought to be can make some little or sometimes big adjustments and get into that place. And the passage today is going to kind of talk through some of that. I know, I should mention, if you are in a family that's not quite where you want it to be, 100%, and again, this is more than just family, in relationships, you know, a couple or a husband, wife, or boyfriend, girlfriend, work relationships, any relationship, and it's not quite where you want it to be, you can get defensive on some of this thing, particularly if there's been a substantial amount of pain. You can get to the place where, I'm not going to put my heart out there again with these unreliable knuckleheads. I'm not going to put my heart out there again with these unreliable people who almost certainly are going to let me down. And I want to acknowledge going in that that's a risk. Just want to be as clear about that as I can be. That's a risk, for sure. And I'd be lying to you if I didn't get real honest about that. But I think, again, what Paul's going to talk about is it's a risk worth taking most of the time, and I just wanted to kind of get into that. So before I start, I'm going to read just a few verses. You can read with me if you want to. Colossians chapter 3, towards the end of the book there, and we're going to read just a few verses. I want to mention again, it's a little controversial, some of this stuff, and it's interesting. A lot of the stuff we've done the last few weeks. It may have been hard at different places, but it's not really controversial. But some of this stuff is kind of controversial. And it's controversial because of how much the world has changed from when Paul was writing the letter to the Colossians and where we're at today. So just for a brief history lesson, if you're not familiar with this, when Paul wrote the letter to the Colossians, in the Roman world, it was commonly understood and accepted that men were in charge. And not just that men were in charge, but that men were the only ones capable of being in charge. That if you rely on women or kids or other people to make the adjustments, they just won't be smart enough or clever enough or together enough to do it. Men need to take lead. And so the Roman law gave men a fantastic amount of power to enforce their rule in the house. Men could do whatever they wanted to do to their kids to try to spark what they needed in obedience. There are some cases even where a man punished his son or daughter so hard that it killed them, and there was never prosecution for that sort of thing. A Roman man had complete and total 100% control of his house. And so there were problems, certainly in Roman houses, but the order was not a problem. Order was not normally a big problem in the Roman house because there was a clearly defined set of order there. But Jesus comes and he kind of shakes all that up. Jesus talks to women and elevates them and asks their opinion about things and tries to reach them and tries to communicate, and this just wasn't done. And not just by, when I say wasn't done, not like, Jesus was one of a very small group that was doing it. It just wasn't done. There's no other author of the same time period writing the same kinds of things the Christians were writing. There's no other author of the same time period. Jesus takes a child and puts him in front of the disciples and says, this is where we're shooting for. You need to be like a little child to get in the kingdom. Bring the little children to me, Jesus says. And he says, you should be looking to serve them. And nobody else was talking that way. And Jesus does kind things for servants and slaves. And again, it was just very much so in that time period was not seen as something that you were supposed to do. But Jesus did it, and then his followers did it. Paul, in another place, writes this down. He says, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free. There's neither male nor female. You're all one in Christ Jesus. And there's just no other author of that time period saying stuff like that. There just isn't any other author in that time period saying that kind of stuff. It was widely agreed upon in the Roman world that some races were better than others. It was widely agreed upon in the Roman world that to be a man was better than to be a woman. It was widely agreed upon that some people were slaves, and that's just how it was, and there's nothing you can do about it. And they didn't debate these sort of things. And then Paul comes and writes stuff like this, and it ticked people off. One of the things the Romans said about the Christians is they're turning the world upside down. They're completely wrecking the agreed upon order of things. And it rattled the community, especially rattled the people who were in power. And so it's that kind of context that Paul writes his letter to the Colossians, right? The Roman world outside is looking suspiciously at the church. Everybody in the church and outside the church thought they understood how family was supposed to be organized, and yet Jesus is challenging all that. And that's the world that Paul's writing this thing in. And you kind of have to understand the context of that to appreciate the choices that Paul makes in his instruction. So here's what he says in Colossians. Here's the whole thing. He says, first, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. We're all members of one body. You're called to peace. So whatever you get into, husbands, wives, parents, children, whatever relationship you're dealing with, the goal here is peace. The goal is that we can get along. We're not always going to agree 100%. We're not always going to see the world the same way, but the goal is to get along. That's why Paul won't tell the wives, leave your scummy husbands. That's why he doesn't tell the children, emancipate yourself. It's why he doesn't call for a slave uprising. That's just not how Paul's thinking about in this time period. Peace is our guide. And so to the women, he says, women, wives, he didn't say women, excuse me, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives. Don't be harsh with them. In our day, this second line is seen to be logical, and the first line is seen to be kind of controversial. In Paul's day, the first line would have been seen logical, and the second line would have been seen controversial. So let's deal with the controversy both times. The controversy in terms of how some people look at the first line is, why should anybody have to submit to anybody else? And I don't want to dig too deep into this thing, other than to say, in more than one place, the walk of Christ is that we serve one another. There's no getting away from that, and I don't want to present it in any other way. Ephesians 5:21 says, submit to one another in Christ. Jesus says, the greatest among you will be the one who serves. First place will be the slave of all. You cannot read very deep in the Gospels. You cannot read very deep in Paul's letters to see over and over and over again this call that we should be willing to be humble to what other people want. Doesn't mean you don't ever get your way. Doesn't mean you're the doormat of the world. But this notion that your way is always the right way and you should fight for yourself and fight for your rights, Jesus doesn't really go that direction. And Paul doesn't here either. And so to the wives, he says, you may be with somebody who's kind of hard to live with. Notice he doesn't say obey your husbands. He will tell the children to obey. He'll tell the slaves to obey. Doesn't tell the wives to do it. It just submit. It just go into this thing recognizing that you don't have to get your way all the time. That sometimes he can, and that's fine. Now again, in Paul's day, that wouldn't have been controversial at all. It was just accepted that was how it was going to be. So I think even in Paul's day, there's probably, why say it then? If it was how it was, why does Paul even say it? Well, partly to reassure the church that he's not trying to shake everything all at once. There's partly that. But there's also this notion that you can be technically a servant, but not really. You do what you're asked to do, but there's a lot of sarcasm. Or you do what you're asked to do, but there's a lot of ugly comments back and forth. Eyes are rolled. You do what you're told to do, but you find other ways to get even. Later on. And Paul's asking wives not to do any of that. He's asking them not to do it. Because they certainly could. Husbands certainly could. In our day where it's a little more equal opportunity, husbands can be the ones who need to hear that lesson too, that we're as Christians called to serve. There's no getting away from that. But the other part of it, the controversial for the husband's part, I think in our day it's accepted that if you marry somebody, you marry for love. That wouldn't have been accepted in Paul's day. In our day, it's accepted that if you marry somebody, you're supposed to be in love. And if you're not in love after you've been together for a while, that's something pretty clearly wrong with the marriage. Well, Paul puts the burden for that on the men. He says to the men, you've got to be the initiators. You've got to be the leaders in this thing. And don't be harsh. Harsh can be a couple ways. Certainly it can be anger that some men can wield like a sword, but it can also be the stonewalling that a lot of men are good at, where they come home and they just don't talk at all. They were out all day long and now they just want to watch television or be out in the back in the garage or focus on whatever they want to focus on. So don't be harsh. We're in this thing together. And he calls husbands and wives to serve. So let me start with this. You may not be in the happiest of marriages. It's okay. It happens. But even in that situation, Paul says, you want to give your whole heart to this thing. Submit sometimes even when you don't want to. Love even sometimes when it's not easy, and don't be harsh. And all those things are still good rules for all of us today. He goes on. He says, children, obey your parents in everything. This pleases the Lord. And fathers, don't embitter your children. They'll become discouraged. Again, our culture has shifted. In the Roman world, the first thing would have made complete sense. The second thing would have been controversial. And in our day, it's probably flipped again. So let's talk about that again. Children, obey your parents in everything. I really do think, and it probably requires a whole sermon to get into some detail about that, but I still think that's where you pretty much want to be as parents. If I can give you some advice on that, young parents, don't get in the habit of counting till you get obedience. Okay, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, because what do the kids do? They wait till 3 before they obey you. And I think you want to push for obedience. I think you want to push. Now, this assumes, of course, that you're not making arbitrary rules about stupid things, but I mean, you're in charge. You're not called to be their best friend. You're not called to be their buddy. And I don't think it's wrong for them to obey you. And I don't think it's wrong for you to push for that. I think that's how it's supposed to work. Hopefully, as an adult, you're wiser than your children. That may not be universally true, but hopefully it's mostly true. And in that situation, you're supposed to lead. But when you're leading, Paul says, and he's talking to fathers here, primarily because, again, in the Roman world that he's writing to, mothers weren't in charge of discipline. It was dad. Dad was in charge of everything. So he writes to the fathers. But it could apply to mothers or fathers today. Certainly it could apply to either one today. He says, don't embitter your kid. It staggers me how easy some parents can be to put down or make some sarcastic jab about their kid, and some of that stuff will linger with them forever. And you know I'm telling the truth because you can remember some things your parents said to you when you were just a kid, and it doesn't go away. And you don't ever recognize how much power this stuff has, and it just has fantastic power. So he says, don't embitter your kids. C.S. Lewis has a long article where he talks about how it staggers him how parents will say things to their children they would never say to other children. You know, the teenager in your house, you just rake them over the coals in a way you would never talk to another teenager because the other teenager would never come back. You would permanently end the relationship, but you'll say it to your kid because you feel like they're stuck with you, and you know they're not. In just a few years, they'll be shed of you. So don't on purpose make it hard. Don't on purpose make it mean, and don't discourage them. You know, as parents, that doesn't mean you have to sign off on every crazy idea they have. I don't mean that, but don't discourage them. Push for their best. Push for them to dream. Push for them to take chances. As a parent, you want to be their biggest cheerleader, and that's kind of what Paul's talking about here. And then he gets to this part, and this might be the most controversial part of the whole thing. Because Paul will not say slaves escape. And there's people who say that he should have. They say what Paul should have done is tell all the slaves to be free. Tell all the masters to let their slaves go, and Paul doesn't do it, so he's a terrible person. And I don't want to get too deep into this thing because we certainly, and I'm willing to talk about this at great length with anyone who wants to stay afterward and talk about it. So I'm not trying to hide from it. It's just hard to get all my thoughts together. I just want to point out in world history, from the beginning of recorded time until about the 1800s, slavery was widely accepted as the way to go. No one really disagreed with it. When you try to read in the 1400s or 1200s or the 800s or go all the different history, no one really ever says much about it, with the exception of the Christians who are at different times pushing for this other way to look at it. Most people just accepted it as the way the world works. It's, not good or bad, it's just one of those things. And so it may be that I hear people, some of us are read like on Christian Twitter or something like that, where somebody will say, if I had lived when Washington lived, or if I had lived when Shakespeare lived, or whoever lived, I would have been the one to stand up and call for the right thing. And maybe you would have been, but in my experience, it's very hard to be the one person standing up for the right thing. I don't think most people do it. I think most people will just go with the flow of the culture because they're scared to cause a stir. Now, I don't think that's what Paul's doing in here. I think in this day, what Paul's talking about here, believe it or not, was kind of a paradigm shifting. Paul says to the slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence with the Lord. What Paul is first of all, he's addressing the slaves. That was never done. He's addressing the slaves like they're people who have choices. That was also never done. And he's also addressing them as if they have some agency in their lives. You're in an awful situation. So in that awful situation, he says, do the very best you can. And I know there's some who think he should say more. And like I said, I think that's an honest debate, and we could talk about that more. But I want to pull out of it the nuggets that we can pull out, because there's some stuff here that's really cool. I don't think it's a neat and complete total application to today. What slaves had to do and what you have to do at your job are completely different. No matter how bad your job is, you're not a slave. But there is some comparison points. Paul says it's easy to put on a good effort when they're looking at you, and then when they're not looking at you, not do anything. To put on a good effort when they're paying attention, but when they're not paying attention, you kind of go your own way and live your own way, and you're not really focused on them at all. Paul says, don't do that. He says, you give your best all the time. I found this picture this week. It's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Like on Monday, the guy's just barely off the ground, crawling in there, and Tuesday, but by Friday, in a great mood. Everything's good by Friday. And again, we can do that, right? Monday, and you just don't care about anything, and you just put in the very bare minimum you can do. And then by Friday, you're full of energy, but it's really energy to get away from the job. You don't want to do anything. And I think we know what that's like, to only put our effort in when we're being watched. Paul says you're better than that, which was also kind of a controversial, weird thing to say to slaves in the time that he wrote it. Paul goes on. He says, whatever you do, and he's primarily, again, talking to the slaves here, but it relates to all of it. He says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as if working for the Lord and not for human masters, since you know that you'll receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. So this won't always be the way it is. This was also kind of a controversial thought in Paul's time. You're not a second-class citizen, Paul says. You're going to get the same reward that everybody else is going to get. There's going to come a day when these ranks won't be here any longer. So he says, work with all your heart, wholehearted. And it goes back to the very first thing I talked about in the sermon. Are you willing to put your whole heart out there for knuckleheads, for people who may not do the best with it? Are you willing to put your whole heart out there with people who may not come and return that favor? That's what he's calling for here, and it's a hard thing. I don't want to escape it. It's a hard thing. In fact, I want to talk about it more in a second, but let me finish this out. Paul finishes. He says, it's the Lord Christ you're serving. He says, anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs. There's no favoritism. So he says, if you cut corners now, God is watching. And then he goes on and finishes his thought. He says, masters, provide your slaves with what's right and fair, because you know you have a master in heaven. And God's not going to tolerate it if you treat people poorly. There's going to be a avenging that goes on with the Lord, and you want to pay attention to that. Okay, I want to focus on that middle verse. And that's the rest of our time here. I just want to focus on that middle verse. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as if working for the Lord. I think one of the things that's very hard about a verse like that, when you think about husbands and wives and children and parents and our relationships at work and our relationships in our neighborhood, and it's hard, again, to put your whole heart out there for unreliable people. If I've got a boss at work who's not seeing what I offer, and I'm never getting a raise, I'm never getting promoted, I'm never getting appreciated, it gets very easy to focus on that and my bad treatment and give half effort. If I'm at home and my wife doesn't give me the attention that I think I deserve, does not respond to me the way that I think I should be responded to, does not treat me the way that I think I should be treated, it gets easy for me to take something away from her. And not to do it in the spirit of meanness exactly, but just what's fair is fair. And it's crazy that a person would think this way, because you never evaluate that correctly. My brother and I are kids, and we're in the back seat, and he punches me. He punches me on the arm. He's mad about something. I said something. He punches me. So I punch him back, and I say, we're even. Now, if you are parents, what do you think happens next? Do you think my brother said, well, I guess you're right. We're even. You think that was the end of it? Well, no, because you never grade your pain the same as the other person. My pain's always much worse than your pain. Right? And what I did to you was an accident. What you did to me was on purpose. What I did to you was only because you did something first. What I did to you, I wasn't trying to hurt you, but you were trying so badly to hurt me. I always suspect the worst motive on your part, and I always want to excuse whatever motive I had. So I can't really grade it as even. And that's why, truthfully, that principle, when you're at work and the boss is not treating you like you deserve, so you're going to cut some corners, you're not evaluating that fairly. You can't evaluate that fairly, because you're going to take your pain much harder than it's intended, and you're going to assume that whatever you're doing to get even isn't that big a deal. You're always going to give yourself the benefit of the doubt. You're always going to assume the worst about the other person. And so Paul says, don't get caught up in that. Whatever you do, work at it with your whole heart, as if you're working for the Lord. In other words, don't focus on the other person. You focus on God and what He's done for you. You don't find your energy to be a good husband or wife from the other person. It's cool if you can, but it's not always going to work out. I mean, no matter how awesome the other person is, and husbands, this would be a good time to give the wife's hand a squeeze there, but no matter how awesome the other person is, there's going to be bad days, right? There's going to be bad days. I am convinced in this world there are a handful of truly evil people. They're just wicked through and through, mean. I mean, wake up mean, go to bed mean, take great pleasure in being mean. There are some, but most people are just knuckleheads. They're not mean. They're just broken. If you were to move your hands around, you just knuckleheads all around you today. Very few truly evil people in the room, right? Most people are just doing the best they can, just like you are. And yeah, it's a risk to put your heart out for people like that, but it's a risk worth taking. You know, at work, C.S. Lewis did a graduation message at a college, and he told the students at this college that at work there's a ring. In every job, in every club, in every church, there's a ring. There's a clique, a ring of the people who really know what's going on, the important people. And they may not be the important people in terms of rank. They're the in our language, they're the cool people. They're the ones who are the influencers. They're the pretty people. They're the people that everybody wants to be like. It's like this in every school. It's like this in everything. There's a popular group. And he tells the kids, C.S. Lewis, as he's doing this graduation thing, he says, if you don't think about it, if you don't make plans for it, most people spend their entire life trying to get into this ring. They'll try to dress in a certain way and talk in a certain way and act in a certain way so they can get into the ring, whatever the ring is. And it's different for different people. What I might think is awesome, you might not think is awesome at all. And what you might think is cool may not be something I would chase after. But left unbidden to itself, we all have this group. And social media, which wasn't a thing when Lewis was talking about this, I think it pours gas on the fire. I can look on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok and I can see somebody else who already has what I want. They've already got what I want, and they've got all these followers, and it seems like they're so happy with the things they've got that I want. And so if you don't watch out, you can spend your whole life trying to get into this popular ring. And the sad part, the really goofy, nutty part about it, is that when you get into the ring, if you're lucky enough to make it, you'll find that it really isn't that impressive once you're there, but that there's this other ring a little further up. And so you have to get it closer to that. You've got to go chase this thing. To be part of the group that really knows, to be part of the group that's really the hip group to be around. You know, you walk into the room and there's just a handful of people who are the group to be in. And you can't just walk up to that group and be part of their group. They might be friendly to you, but there's rules for this sort of thing. And it's hard to get in. And if you don't watch out, you'll spend your whole life chasing that sort of thing. What Lewis said, the better strategy, he says, devote yourself to being the very best at your job you can be. Whatever your job is. It's the same thing Paul's saying here. Whatever you do, you just work at it with all your heart. Just devote yourself. Because when you do that, he says, you know the best mechanics in town? They know who the other best mechanics are. The best doctors know who the other best doctors are. The people who are the smartest about anything. The best coaches, the best swimming instructors, the best, they all know, right? I mean, if you're really good at something, you know who the other people are who are also really good. And what happens is you get into this better kind of ring. You've become a craftsman or an artisan or you're the very best at what you do because you work at it with all your heart. The people who in a church, the ones who are really the closest to Jesus, I mean, they think about it. It's in their mind all the time. They hunger for the Lord, right? I mean, it means something to them. They know who the other people are like that. And they may or may not be preachers or elders or deacons. Sometimes a person can become a preacher, an elder, or a deacon for lots of reasons that may or may not have much to do with how much they love Jesus. But the ones who really love Jesus, they know who they are. You know who the other ones are. The guys who, what Jim was talking about, communion, the guys who have really devoted themselves and they are becoming gentle and patient and they see the others. And that's really the ring that you want to pursue. Whatever you do. He says, work at it with all your heart as if you're working for the Lord. You know, when you make that commitment to do it, I wrote in a newsletter article a couple of weeks ago, I really do believe, I watch a lot of sports, I really do believe that one player on a team, if it's the right player, can change the whole culture of the program. I really do believe that. I've seen it happen on some of my favorite teams. One player comes in with the drive, right? And it can't be the last guy on the bench usually. It can't be that guy. It's got to be somebody who's got some talent, they've got some skill. You know, it doesn't have to be the best player on the team either, but if they really just, you know, this matters. And they go at practice super crazy hard and they push. One person changed the whole program. Why doesn't that happen then to every program? Why doesn't that happen at every sports team? Well, because it's hard. And it's hard not just because of the energy you got to do it. It's hard because of everybody's reaction when you start. When you start, the other people will not be impressed. They'll ask you to back it down a couple notches. You're making us look bad. They'll ask you to who are you trying to impress? They may even kind of ostracize you a little bit, think you're weird. They with that inner ring, the cool people on the team, they may want to keep their distance from you, and that's really painful. But it's true, and if you can get through that awful moment at the beginning, you can change a whole team. I think you can change a marriage. I really do. I think one person comes in and they make this decision that they're going to give their whole heart to a person who may be a knucklehead. And so you give your whole heart to it, and they don't even notice what you're doing. Or when they do notice, they make some little sarcastic jab about it, and that's going to hurt a lot. And if you don't watch out, the first couple times that happens, you'll just quit because it's too much. And I won't blame you if you quit. It's really hard. But I think one person, if they commit, they can transform a marriage. They really can because we're drawn to that kind of enthusiasm. We're drawn to that kind of devotion. You know, our heroes are people who are like that. The people who we put posters on the wall for, I mean, they're people who are, we want to be, these are our heroes. The ones who wanted more than anything else to achieve this thing, whatever this thing is. And I really think it has such power. I think we have the Holy Spirit working with us. Whatever we do, all our heart, because we're working with God. We just can't give up. And so my prayer for you today as we kind of wind out this sermon and we think about what to do next is that you don't give up. I know in the room here, there's some unhappy families. Just because, I know that. Because it's true. If I spoke at another church, it'd be true there too. It's just how the human condition. I know there's some unhappy parents and kids that don't totally get along that well together. I know there's some people at work who feel completely unappreciated and undervalued. And maybe because of all that feeling, you've just been mailing it in for years. And I won't blame you because that's easy to do. I just hope that I can put some spark into you that there's a better way. All right, let me pray for you. Now the band come back up. Dear Lord God, I thank you for the people who are here. And God, maybe one or two or three or four of them need to rededicate themselves to you. Father, rededicate their hearts to you. I thank you for the promise that you are, that God, first of all, you're good. And if we rededicate to you, you're going to be compassionate for us. You're going to hear our prayers. You're going to care what we have to say. And that, God, you're going to respond. And I thank you for that. And I also thank you, God, that you have some power. And we're not all by ourselves in the world. And that, God, if we call out to you and if we ask you to move, that you're going to move. And that you're the same God who in the Bible did all those awesome things. And that, God, you'll move in us too if we ask you to. So I pray for that. For anybody who wants to draw closer to you. In Jesus' name, amen.